Well, welcome to this second seminar in Lent term, the World Christianity Seminar run here in the faculty in collaboration with the Center for Care Center for Christianity Worldwide. My name is Jörg Kosch. I'm an associate professor in World Christianity in the faculty, and I'll be chairing this meeting today. I also bring apologies and greetings from Muttar Swami, who is not feeling well today and therefore is unable to join us. But we had agreed that I would share the session anyway, because it's I'm very pleased and a little bit proud as well to present Christian Anderson to you here and his seminar, because he's just handed in his thesis last Friday. In a turnaround that we didn't realize would be quite this tight when he took on the task of presenting here his now finished PhD project on, well, insider movements in Islam, or what people against these movements sometimes call Chrislam. I first ran into these kinds of movements in Ethiopia back in 2012, when I picked up this magazine on Amharic that was just had Chrislam on the title and had all of these articles against it, but I had no idea what was going on. I asked some people and they were telling me, well, yeah, we're doing these amazing conversions in mosques that we're just going somewhere in the Rift Valley, and then we'll meet some sheikh who's dreamed of Jesus, and but we won't call them pastors, we don't even call them Christians, women can keep wearing hijab, and we'll just take the crescent off the mosque, but we consider them as followers of Jesus within Islam. I thought, whoa, this is really, really strange and interesting. And always had meant to dig into this, which really didn't materialize for various reasons. And of course, it's a very controversial subject. In fact, it's not something I could be researching now. But as I was thinking about this, and as I came here to Cambridge, actually talking about these movements also as my trial lecture here, I had already an application on my desk waiting for me, somebody who wanted to study these movements, not in Ethiopia, but more on the sort of global scale of what was going on in this debate. And this is of course, Christian, and so he's been working on this in the past 3.5 years, and is here then now to present his results. And we are eagerly awaiting your presentation and discussion with you. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Jörg. And Jörg has been an excellent supervisor, and I could not have hoped for a better supervisor. It's quite unexpected, actually, for this project. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm not sure how we're going to go without the slides in the room. You're just going to have to be good at listening. And you don't want to press join audio? Don't touch anything?
The presentation.
Okay. What about I need to?
Can you just click on later?
I see my cursor. I will start and we'll see if we can get the slides going for the people. Okay, let's do it.
Oh, can you go back now?
Excellent. Okay. In a shaded room, nestled behind palm trees just north of Los Angeles in March 1975, two seminary professors sat and distilled the centuries-old problem of Muslim evangelism down to 4 basic questions, then typed them onto a single piece of paper. Could Muslims become Christians without becoming culturally Western, was the first one. Could the gospel be conveyed to them without inherently offending them? And in this regard, quote, do we have the right to de-emphasize aspects of it, such as Son of God and the Trinity, unquote. Third, could Muslims start with their own idea of God rather than having to jettison it as a, quote, precondition to salvation? And most intriguingly of all, was it possible to start a Jesus-oriented faith renewal within Islam? Both men were convinced that the answer in all 4 cases was yes. It was just a matter of persuading colleagues, students, missionaries, and sending churches of this new way to engage 600 million Muslims. In fact, a 40-year provocation within American and global evangelical circles over these matters was just beginning. The professors were Charles Craft and Ralph Winter, 2 of the more idiosyncratic on an already eccentric faculty at Fuller Seminary School of World Mission. The campus in which they sat had been built just 20 years before. Fuller had been founded to move American evangelicals beyond fundamentalism towards a more socially and intellectually engaged future. And in the mid-1970s, the future of missions was contextualization, with which a new generation of evangelicals were combining an interest in anthropology's communication potential, an openness to seeing the good in all cultures, and an ambition to take the gospel to every ethnic group on earth. Applied to the Muslim frontier, these principles were to yield extraordinary configurations. From Muhammad being redrawn as a mediator of a biblically informed monotheism to the Arabs, to Western missionaries participating in Ramadan and Muslim prayers, church services redesigned as mosque liturgies, new converts continued to identify as Muslim, and contextualized Bible translations that employed Quranic phrases and avoided translating the Son of God literally. Okay. The attempt at evangelicalism's flagship seminary to reimagine Islam as something that Jesus did not defy, but reconfigured and renewed was a remarkable departure. But the conundrums of adapting Christianity for Muslim societies could hardly be solved in Californian classrooms. More than ever, missions to Muslims were an activity in which many parties had a stake, and in the case of church leaders in Asia and the Middle East, on which they had strong opinions. The ideas that surfaced in the 70s only became more controversial over time. Tensions bubbled up at the turn of the century in an argument about whether missionaries had crossed the line into Islamic syncretism, and they climaxed in a painfully divisive debate over Muslim targeted Bible translations in the 2010s that only abated after Wycliffe Bible translators had been held to account by an international evangelical tribunal. We're going to look at the saga in 4 episodes, spending a bit more time on the first 2, I think, lesser known episodes out of the 4. Episode 1, Contextualization and the Search for Muslim Equivalents. American evangelicals leafing through Christianity Today in late 1978 were met with a prominent article by evangelical world statesman John Stott, titled Christians and Muslims. But its surprising subtitle would have raised eyebrows. Quote, some barriers are cultural rather than theological. In the piece, Stott called for an end to, quote, the bad old days of bitter polemic against Muhammad and Islam, end quote, and for the start of a bold new era of empathetic evangelism that sought ways for Muslims to retain their Islamic heritage. Can we even contemplate the normally uncontroversial, Stott asked his readers, quote, Jesus mosques instead of churches, and Jesus Muslims instead of Christians? That Stott himself was publicly contemplating such apparent oxymorons reflected an ambitious reimagining of Islam by mission-minded evangelicals in this period. He was writing on the back of attending 2 contextualization consultations in California and Bermuda, and in the lead up to a large Muslim evangelism conference in Colorado. It was a season in which leading US evangelical mission thinkers, aided by other evangelicals in the Middle East and Asia, saw ways of recasting Muslim populations and even Islam itself in a more hopeful light, not as spiritual enemy, but as opportune receptacle for the Christian gospel. This involved, firstly, remapping Islam as socio-ethnic units and cultural symbols during the 50s and 60s, with America increasingly asserting its global presence amid the threat of communism. The challenge of Islam had become less prominent. Instead, when members of a more culturally savvy generation of evangelicals cast their missionary gaze, it was with an eye to using the tools of the social sciences to evangelize ethnicities rather than religious blocs, and to reap, as one missionary anthropologist recalled, quote, the ripe harvest of the animist world. Well, pivotal to this change of approach was Donald McGavran, and his appointment as founding dean of Fuller Seminary School of Missions in 1965. As a missionary in South India in the first half of the 20th century, McGavran had seen large group conversions of lower caste Hindus to Christianity, and he agreed with his mentor, Methodist Bishop Wascott Pickett, that while these baptisms demonstrated that Western missions had too long ignored the logic of converting in socio-cultural groups rather than as individuals. In his widely read Bridges of God, McGavran quoted Pickett directly. He said, the process of extracting individuals from their setting in Hindu or Muslim communities doesn't build a church. On the contrary, it rouses antagonism against Christianity. It builds barriers against the spread of the gospel. The mission station approach was outdated, and the solution was to create a Christhood movement within a society for missionaries who had labored for isolated Muslim converts, only to see many of them reconvert in order to rejoin their previous communities. This was a path forward with immediate appeal. I can't move my slides on here either. So,
No.
okay. That's how we do it. All right.
No, that's display back again.
McGavin had brought with him to Fuller his own Institute of Church Growth. He assembled a faculty directed towards evangelizing these socio-ethnic groups. And by the 1970s, the world of Islam, along with the rest of the globe, had been divided up into less daunting units. In Ralph Winter's famous Unevangelized Peoples Directory at the Lausanne Conference, the Berbers of Algeria, or the Hui of northwestern China, the Iraqi Kurds, so on, they were counted among the world's least reached, but were only Muslim in this sense by coincidence. The category of Islam could still be drawn upon to raise mission urgency. McGavin and Winter did that. But macro-religious status was relativized to the cluster of what made up an ethnicity. And ironically, it was as evangelicals looked past Islam in this way to the study of culture, that an entire Muslim world religion began to be transfigured as well into something that was far more prime for the Christian charisma. In the 1950s, anthropology had begun to acquire its own allure for gospel communication. Aspiring missionaries at Wheaton, including Billy Graham himself, famously in the 1940s, and at Hartford Kennedy School of Missions, were being trained in anthropology. A new breed of linguists and Bible translators, most connected with the Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL, and the American Bible Society, soon thrashed out their ideas in a journal called Practical Anthropology. Long before it was Christian Contextualization, a science of cross-cultural communication that encompassed both evangelism and Bible translation was fleshed out at Fuller Seminary and at Wycliffe SIL and the American Bible Society. The task of gospel communication was scrutinized through these lenses of form and function. Select the right symbols, and this supracultural message could, in the view of these practitioners, these thinkers, be encoded into any society and take root. In this light, Islam and American Christianity as well were cultural systems that had assigned meanings to symbols, and the missionaries' aim was not to propagate their own system, but to bring allegiance to Christ within an existing meaning system. Read widely by both missionaries and translators, Eugene Nider's books in particular prodded evangelicals towards a different way of relating their Bibles to culture. Nider insisted that meaning was the measure of translation. Soon followed that not only was there was no immutable word-for-word correspondence between sacred text and faithful translation, but also that the language structure of the text could and often should be changed too. The test of effective communication is, of course, the response, said Nider. The focus was now on the receptor, how to delve into their strange thought world to produce the equivalent emotive response that was intended by the biblical author of their readers. Nider called the approach dynamic equivalence. Now, applied to English Bibles in the American Protestant heartland, Nider's receptor-friendly approach certainly elicited a response. The Good News for Modern Man version of the New Testament, after hitting the bookstores and supermarket shelves in 1966, sold 8.5 million copies within 2 years, and was itself eclipsed in popularity in the early 70s by the yet more colloquial Living Bible. Meanwhile, at Fuller Seminary, members of McGavin's faculty saw the potential of dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence for missions. Potent religious symbols, in the same way as language, could be used to express gospel truth. In 1974, Charles Kraft used his assigned slots at a Christian broadcasting conference to pursue this hypothesis. He threw out to bewildered attendees a set of striking propositions for dynamic equivalence church for Arab Muslims. Rather than a literal rendering of Western church patterns onto the Middle East, it would adapt Arabic culture to recreate the impact of the early church. This might involve, he conjectured, Friday worship, ritualized prayer patterns, fasting, and a more, quote, distantly monotheist faith that drew from the Old Testament. As for the thorny term Son of God, Kraft argued that only its meaning was sacred, but that the word form, which had quite a different set of connotations for Muslims, should be replaced. On this point, one Muslim background delegate from Iran was prepared to question Kraft directly. He said, quote, "I'm not a theological professor, Dr. Kraft. I suppose it's easy for people like you in your position to make such statements. But when we deal with people on the street and in our common life, are we not denying Christ?" Well, between 1974 and 1978, the energetic program of contextualization coming out of Fuller, explored in a series of consultations, was powerful enough to forge a new direction for evangelical missions to Muslims, reaching its zenith in 1978 when 150 American and international evangelicals gathered for the North American Conference on Muslim Evangelization. I'm going to move forward here, but if you want to talk about some of the tensions of that conference afterwards, we can, including people being disturbed about bypassing the traditional churches. We're going to move on to another part of this contextualization, reimagining the Quran and Muhammad into the Christian story. Daring recontemplations of Islam drew evangelicals to reconsider the nature of the Quran. In fact, American evangelical innovators found there were already, by the mid-70s, actually like-minded evangelists in the Middle East and South Asia reimagining the potential role of the Quran and of Muhammad in the evangelistic task, and even in the Christian story. Foremost among them was head of the Bible Society in Lebanon, Fawad Achab, who produced a much circulated tract, Have You Ever Read the 7 Muslim Christian Principles? I don't know if you can see it there. Yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
With a format borrowed from Bill Bright's 4 Spiritual Laws tract, the document began with a creative rereading of the Bismillah, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, God, Word, and Holy Spirit. And it selected verses from the Quran, set alongside verses from the Old Testament law, the Psalms, and the Gospels, to convey to the Muslim their need for Jesus. The tract was already being used successfully by evangelical missionaries in Lebanon by 1978, and it caused a stir at this North American Conference on Muslim Evangelization. This positive interaction with the Quran, while evangelistically motivated, was in several cases part of something more fundamental, a repositioning of Islam in relation to Christianity, in which the Quran was afforded a legitimate place within a larger narrative of the gospel going to the Arab peoples. As Achad and someone else called Abdul Haq, who was also doing something similar, the Quran explicitly affirmed the Old Testament and New Testament, and as a text, it positions itself only as a confirmation and an Arabic-speaking clarification of what had gone before. With sympathy towards Muhammad's highly mediated access to Jewish and Christian scripture, the partial nature of Quranic revelation could be reimagined chronologically, not as having come after the gospel and opposed it, but either as situated between the testaments with true but incomplete knowledge of Messiah, like the Samaritan woman of John 4, or even within the trajectory of the Acts narrative as the point at which the Arabs began to hear about Christ in their own language, even if this was later obscured behind the Hadith tradition, according to that reading. This reworking of Islam into the Christian narrative was taken further at Fuller Seminary, as it usually was, where during the 1970s, the twin maverick figures of Charles Kraft and Ralph Winter taught missionaries that early Islam had been an authentic, if imperfect, indigenization of Christianity. Kraft instinctively saw Muhammad as a pioneering missionary to his own people, and one who shared Kraft's own concern for cross-cultural equivalence. Quote, the problem that faced Muhammad, Kraft, was how can Arabs feel at home in expressing the kind of faith relationship to God that the Christians and the Jews and their holy books recommend, end quote. Ralph Winter put this into a larger scheme. Muhammad was starting a, quote, Semitic breakaway movement, end quote, from a dominantly Hellenic Christianity, said Winter, who drew an analogy with the Protestant Reformation, when the, quote, northern peoples of Europe broke with a culturally Mediterranean Christian tradition. Winter did stop short of celebrating Islam's spread. It was, as he saw it, a heretical Christian form arising from a failure of Hellenic Christianity to pass back what it first received from the Semitic peoples. But in any case, these were contentious formulations, which they didn't represent the evangelical mainstream, and yet, nevertheless, from the mid to late 70s, it was Kraft and Winter who taught missionaries about evangelizing Muslims at American Evangelicalism's flagship seminary. In addition, the rapid growth of Messianic Judaism in America during the 70s fed the imagination of missiologists, provided an analogy for what a Christ movement inside Islam might look like. So Ralph Winter in 1974 started drawing the connection between Jews for Jesus and the idea of Muslim Christians. He soon began to argue that given Muslims actually revered Jesus in practice more than Jews, a Muslims for Jesus movement should be easier to achieve. Well, regardless of the analogy's imprecision, the vision of a global groundswell of Messianic Muslims powerfully fused the people movement doctrine that McGavran was working on with a fulfillment theology and helped to evoke the prospect of a large-scale theological turn to Christ across the global Muslim Ummah. There was another initiative, quite radical, of translating the New Testament into Quranic Arabic. After several years studying under Craft at Fuller Seminary, David Owen moved to Jerusalem's West Bank in 1979. This is his book that he's going to work on, with a sense that he was enacting an historic moment in the story of Arabic Bible translation. He recruited the help of a Muslim background Palestinian poet, Adnan Biden, began to translate the four Gospels into Quranic-style Arabic with the aim of giving Arab Muslims for the first time a New Testament that was both Islamic in terminology and classical in literary style. It would be, Owen hoped, a text that would finally provide the foundation for a messianic movement within Islam. What Owen and Biden eventually published in 1987 pushed the boundaries of conventional Bible translation, harmonized the Gospels into one account, into the edition of Tatian's Diatessaron, and it was called Sirat al-Mashiach, Life of the Messiah, the title fashioned after the traditional biographies of Muhammad. He used a rhyming prose that resembled the Qurans. It began each chapter by inserting the Bismillah in the name of Allah, the merciful and compassionate. And in pursuit of dynamic equivalence, Islamic terms were used wherever possible. I think you can see here, yeah, I don't know. When Jesus, with the Passover approaching, set his face towards Jerusalem, the Sirat could depict him in hues of Muslim piety, turning towards Bait el-Maqdis, Jerusalem, at the time of Eid el-Nahr, Feast of Sacrifice, which evokes the Muslim day of sacrifice, the Eid al-Adha, in order to perform the Hajj. So Jesus going to Jerusalem at the time of the festival was translated as going to perform the Hajj. Though many verses indicating Jesus' divinity were rendered conventionally, the translation steered clear of the term Son of God, referring instead to either Messiah or the Word or the Beloved of God, and amending Jesus' reference to God as Father to Allah. So Father was not used for the divine God, in terms of divinity. This was explained by Owen, to avoid Muslim readers interpreting the father-son metaphor in, quote, crude anthropomorphic terms. Now, just how much Islam had been reimagined in a hospitable gospel setting was also evident in a new willingness of evangelical missionaries to themselves take part in Muslim religious activity. And in particular, by the 1980s, it had become widespread practice for evangelical missionaries to participate in Ramadan. But for some missionaries, it extended beyond this to partaking of the feasts at the end of Ramadan and the festival of sacrifice, to ablutions, washings before prayers, and saying daily prayers in the style of Salah, and even for a select few to attending mosque prayers. This was never divorced from the desire to convert Muslims to Christ. These participations, though, often had an empathetic dimension. Missionaries saw themselves as imitating Paul in becoming like the Jew to win the Jews, 1 Corinthians 9. Not only to, quote, win as many as possible, but also to emulate the mode of Christ's incarnation, relinquishing one's position to come close to those who might be redeemed, 1 Corinthians 11. An extended defense of such an approach was given in 1989 in a difficult to access journal called Interconnect by an anonymous couple referring themselves as Bill and Jane. As newly assigned Bible translators, they had arrived in 1983 in an unnamed Muslim majority country, it was probably in South Asia, determined that their own lives would model the notion that a Muslim can follow Jesus without leaving behind their cultural heritage. They gave each other and their children Muslim names. They experimented with referring to themselves as Jesus Muslims and people of the book before settling on Isai, Jesus once. Jane wore a chador in the nearby city and a burqa while in the villages. Starting with ablutions and facing Mecca and using the Salat sequence of prostrations, they said daily prayers in English and using Bible verses. The couple always participated in Ramadan and both annual feasts, and occasionally Bill attended mosque prayers during his own version of Salat simultaneously with the Arabic liturgy. The couple saw them moving from outsider status towards insider status as what God did in identifying with humans. Quote, one could be the world's leading expert on the fast of Ramadan, they argued. But without participating in the fast, one could not know how it feels to be a Muslim during that month, end quote. They didn't mind, actually, that rumors had spread in their district that they'd become Muslims. Their aim was to show that differences in worship practices between Christians and Muslims were ultimately inconsequential. Quote, these things don't matter. Culture is not the issue. Christ is the issue, end quote. We're going to speed up a little bit, but this is the second episode, the making of Muslim followers of Jesus in Bangladesh. After Bangladesh's war of independence and a series of natural disasters, large amounts of international aid came into the country. With their existing networks, American missionaries were given prominent roles in large-scale distribution projects. Phil Parshall, in his 10th year in Bangladesh with International Christian Fellowship, was asked by Stanley Mooneyham, who was the head of World Vision, if Parshall could help them get their work there up and running. Now, this marked the beginning of an eventful decade in Parshall's missionary career, in which political upheaval and the legitimizing role of foreign aid afforded space for a brief but successful contextualization experiment that took place in 2 villages outside of Dhaka between 1975 and 1980. The installment resulted in what quickly became the book on Muslim evangelism as far as evangelicals are concerned. New Paths in Muslim Evangelism, Evangelical Approaches to Contextualization, which Parshall published in 1980. Now, not credited in the book is a very interesting character, a Muslim background Bangladeshi Christian who Parshall appears to have learned from, named Akand. I won't go into more length in my thesis, but in 1974, Parshall reported excitedly that Akand was winning, quote, scores of Muslims to Christ in an unnamed part of the country. Akand's converts met on Fridays and had been inducted into, quote, a biblically sound yet culturally attractive faith, so Muslims. With Akand now planning to establish a whole series of these indigenous churches. Well, Parshall followed suit, and the path taken by him and his missionary team was certainly less traveled, even if perhaps Akand had got there just ahead of them. With the country in the midst of famine, the enlarged ICF team sent 3 missionary families to a satellite town 40 miles from Dhaka, from where they conducted evangelism in villages further afield. And they were aiming to establish fledgling contextualized gatherings. And by 1979, Parshall could report back to Donald McGavran's seminar at Fuller that 37 heads of family had been won to Christ in 2 villages, though interestingly not as yet many of their wives. It's an interesting one to think about. The new believers called themselves, quote, followers of Isa, Jesus, rather than Christians. On Fridays at 1 p.m., so an exact sort of competition with the mosque time, parallel to the mosque, they went to a designated home, removed shoes, conducted ritual washing in the style of wudu, and sat on the floor with Bibles elevated on folding Quran stands. Then they lifted their hands and prostrated themselves in prayer, and in Quranic style chanted sections of the Bible, such as the Lord's Prayer. True to the homogeneous unit principle, the gathering was Muslim background only, which reported Parshall had led to a conundrum when a Hindu background mother of one of the members also wanted to follow Jesus. Socially and materially, the new Jesus followers lived a strange existence. Most of them had not been baptized, but their alternative mosque gathering was, even at the local level, viewed with some hostility. Many were physically beaten by village elders. Parshall's team had journeyed into unfamiliar territory too with their own observances. The missionary women frequently wore burqa, while the men with full beards dressed in lungi and t-shirts. Going further than abstaining from pork, they experimented with ritual washing before prayer and keeping Ramadan. But this permissiveness stopped at the door to the Muslim mosque. Here, in contrast, Parshall drew a line. Both Parshall and another missionary called Paul Thomas considered mosque attendance to be inseparable from the Shahada confession within the Imam-led prayer sequence, which affirmed Muhammad as the prophet of God. This, for Parshall, represented an Islamic theology that was irreconcilable with Christ's faith. And so for the new convert to continue to attend prayers involved either for Parshall compromise or deceit. Instead, he thought they should be given a few weeks to transition out of mosque attendance permanently. And he hoped for believing communities that had not been torn away, though, from the mainstream of their religious society. Now, many of the Bangladeshi national churches, especially those affiliated with the World Council of Churches, were opposed to what Parshall was trying. But largely Pasha was able to keep going unhindered. And he benefited from a Bible society that had been persuaded to work towards a more Muslim-friendly New Testament called the Musulmani Bangla Injil Sharif, which was published in 1980. But as the new country found its feet, missionaries, not least those evangelizing Muslims, came under increasing scrutiny, and Pasha left the country in 1982 permanently over a fragile visa situation. There would still be room, though, for Muslim contextualization in Bangladesh, but it would be that which, with less scruples than Partial, found ways to integrate evangelism into development work, as well as Jesus' faith into Islam. Now, World Vision, at this stage of its expansion and evolution, readily combined evangelism with a particular kind of social concern that emphasized community development and was also keenly interested in reaching Muslims. And there wasn't an interest reducible to proselytization. World Vision poured resources into parts of the Muslim world where no evangelistic payback was possible, but it did want evangelistic breakthrough. And it has sponsored actually the big Muslim evangelistic conference in Colorado in 1978. Now, when severe floods hit Bangladesh in 1983, World Vision agreed to help the Bangladeshi government on the condition they be allowed to do longer-term community development west of Dhaka. Again, the project was led by Bangladesh Field Director Milton Coke. I've got a picture of him there, who had completed a fuller PhD on Bible translation as mission strategy. And he recruited and trained 25 couples from Bangladeshi churches to move into the 5 communities that they'd agreed with the World Vision and enact a holistic mission. They were trained in all sorts of development work, and they're also primed for Muslim evangelism. Actually, the project from a development work proved a success, but from evangelism proved a failure because the Christian couples were considered unclean for not taking a morning ghusl wash after sleeping next to their spouses. So the locals refused to eat with them. But when this was rectified, they figured this out during the project. Their presence was now gratefully received, but they were still regarded as irreligious for not performing their salat prayers. In 1984, the worst floods for a decade afforded more opportunities for World Vision, and this time, Coke's team designed a more religiously adapted approach with remarkable results. So Coke had already recruited 2 leaders with a Muslim background this time. One was called Sam Allen, which is an anglicized version of his Bengali name. He worked on actually the Bible Society's Muslim Bengali New Testament, and Rafiq Uddin, who later wrote about their approach. Now, in 1985, for a World Vision project further north in the country, they employed 5 married couples, all of whom were former Muslims, so Muslim background Christians. And this time, the month-long training included not just development training, but included learning a form of salat prayers, 5 daily prayers, that replaced Quranic verses with biblical passages. Now, in Uddin's account, the breakthrough occurred when these couples returned to their own villages and were able to show their estranged families, because they become Christians and their families were Muslim, that through the manner of their salat prayers and their Ramadan observance, and in several cases their mosque attendance, that they had not in fact renounced Islam or become Christian, but rather they had, quote, Uddin, found God through Jesus Christ. In one area, Uddin claimed, at least 1,200 people had come to Christ over a 2-year period, including 3 mosque imams. Dudley Woodbury from Fuller, who visited the country in 1989, estimated that, quote, many thousands in total have been converted. He suggested that other factors were at play. I won't go into that. Anyways, perhaps most critical to the breakthrough was the evangelist position when challenged on their loyalty to Muhammad and the Quran. On the one hand, they affirmed the legitimacy of Muhammad as God's messenger to the Arabs, and yet they've been able to articulate, using both Quran and Bible, how Jesus, not Muhammad, was the one described as unique intercessor with Allah. And they used surahs from the Quran to point to this. For Bengali Muslims, there is a Mahdi figure who is spiritually indispensable to judgment, and they attributed this figure to Muhammad. But the evangelists pointed to Surah 43:61, a verse traditionally interpreted as Jesus' second coming being the signal for judgment, to argue that it was Jesus, not Muhammad, who would intercede for them on that final judgment day, which the New Testament also attested to, e.g. 1 Timothy 2, verse 5. As the movement grew, Coke acted decisively to set up financial and organizational support structures for it. He registered a dedicated non-profit entity and worked with his core leaders to buy up fish farms that would provide income in the villages where the movement was spreading. And by the early 1990s, new groups were being started everywhere across Bangladesh, even across the Indian border. And in 1992 alone, according to Koch, the movement doubled in size and number. A survey done by Fuller Seminary and the Pew Research Center in 1995 estimated there were 4,500 Messianic Muslims just in one little area of the Northwest. Extrapolated using Koch's numbers, admittedly, so they might not be reliable, but it was conjectured that this could be as many as 45,000 around the country. The movement's purposeful but fraught departure from traditional Bengali Christianity in order to identify with Islam was embodied in the remarkable life journey of someone called Abdul Mana, who joined Koch's team around 1994, and within a few years had become the head of the whole Jamaat gathering network across the country, these groups. While coming after Udin and Alan and taking on a national coordinating role, his own ministry actually preceded what Koch's team were attempting and complicates the movement's genealogy. Having converted to Christianity from an esteemed Sufi background in about 1970, Mana had been cut off from his family networks. He initially found work as a rickshaw driver before marrying a Christian wife, and then he found employment within Christian circles. He became an ordained elder and pastor within the Select Presbyterian Synod of Bangladesh, and, very unusually given his Muslim background, he was eventually elected as its general secretary. He also spent time overseas, studying in an English seminary between 1985 and 1987. By this time, he was striking out on a different, I should say, I think it was all nations seminary. By this time, he was striking out on a different path to the Church of Bangladesh, though. According to Koch, around 1983, Manan began to encourage a small group of Muslim believers to stay within Islam for the sake of winning their people to faith. Now, in 1991, he appears to have taken an additional personal step of re-identifying with Islam, upon which he returned to his family. And he explained his Jesus faith as a fulfillment of Islam and succeeded in reconciling with them. So it was a move that really resembled Udin's evangelists as well, what they did in 1985. By 1994, Manan's own project was similar enough to that other endeavor that after Manan began to partner with Koch's team, the two sets of believers they represented could be thought of as one movement. Part of it started by Manan in the northeast of the country, and then Koch and Udin's one started in the northwest. Mainly illiterate, these Jamaat members listened to the Bible on audio cassettes, and they learned to recite passages at worship. In Koch's view, the Bangladeshi Bible Society's India Sharif, which used Allah for the divine name and Quranic names of the Prophet, was only a start, even though it was controversial. The traditional churches didn't like that, but for Koch, that was nowhere near enough. It fell short by opting for neutral rather than Quranic terms for religious activities and roles and places. So not long after David Owen published his Sirat al-Mashir, Koch had Sam Allen begin work on a Bengali version, and that was completed in 1999. And Koch was aiming to have this the Sirat translated into other languages too. I'll keep going. Overall, the movement in Bangladesh exhibited a remarkable capacity to grow amid the strictures of Bengali Islam and Bangladeshi society. Believers referred to themselves as completed Muslims or Muslim followers of Isa. They kept quite separate from the traditional churches and preferred to marry within their own circles. A significant proportion continued to attend mosque on Fridays, or at least at the Qurbani and Al-Fitr feasts. At the liturgical clause, Muhammad is the messenger of God, they either stayed silent or substituted the biblical statement, Jesus is the word of God, instead of Muhammad is the messenger of God, with its echoes of Jesus' status as a word from Allah in Surah 339. Or they simply substituted Jesus, Isa, for Muhammad. This coexistence with Bengali Islam was not spontaneous. It kind of required restraint. And in an internally circulated strategy paper, Milton Koch summarized the approach as having 4 absolute injunctions. We never ever speak against God, whose name is Allah. We never ever speak against the Quran, which is a holy book to Muslims. We never ever speak against Islam, the worldwide community, and we never ever speak against the Prophet to Arabs, Muhammad. Group members, continued Koch, were born Muslim and should stay that way. In fact, they must, quote, resist all temptation to convert to Christianity, end quote. There were points of abrasion with Bengali society despite all this. The national government at one point banned the Injil Sharif, and it acted to squeeze out what it perceived as proselytization. And at the village level, persecution was inevitable for many of the new believers in these groups. Okay, episode 3. We're going to keep going. 10 minutes left?
I think so.
No worries. Yeah, I don't know when I'm stopping, but yes, need to stop here, stop at 5?
Yes.
Absolutely, no problem at all. Yeah, no, that's fine. Soon after this, many missionaries began to copy the Bangladesh approach to missions around the world. At the same time, renewed zeal for Muslim evangelism took place across a tumultuous backdrop. American Christians' attitude to Islam would be affected by the accession of a militant Islamic regime in Iran in 1979 and the rise to prominence of more fundamentalist versions of Islam in the 1980s with the Gulf War and a sense of Islam as a growing religion in America. These changed the complexion of the previous support to Muslim contextualization, as well as an embrace of deliverance ministry and spiritual warfare at Fuller Seminary, which became more combative as an approach to Islam, particularly folk Islam and the perception that Islam had, in reality, lots of demons. It was strewn with demons at the kind of folk level. But I'm going to move on to this debate, which you probably know about, the C spectrum. In 1998, an article was published by John Travis, a pseudonym, and Travis was one of a whole generation of American missionaries who had arrived in West Java, Indonesia in the late 1980s, working with Frontiers, OC, and Navigators mission agencies, looking to put into practice what Milton Coke was doing in Bangladesh and Indonesia. And he published in 1998 a spectrum of different approaches that he'd seen in terms of gathering Muslim background converts. And can you see it? Maybe you can't see it. The people listening online can see it. Travis's spectrum described 5 types of Christ-centered communities. C1 described situations where missionaries had introduced a traditional church that was foreign to Muslims in both language and culture. C2, where traditional church forms were combined with more familiar language for Muslims. C3 incorporated the music, dress, and art of the local Muslim culture, but not its religious forms. C4 took this step further with, quote, the utilization of biblically permissible Islamic forms, such as Muslim prayer postures and Islamic religious terms, with believers calling themselves followers of Isa rather than Christians. C5 is where believers remained legally and socially within the community of Islam. So you've seen this in Bangladesh, and they call themselves Muslims who follow Isa. C6 on this scale denoted secret gatherings of Muslim background believers who, under the threat of death, did not openly profess faith in Jesus at all. Now, the scale hinted that Travis's approach, C5, was not only a legitimate option for missionaries, but the most contextualized one. Travis was explicit that C6 was not ideal, implying that at this point, disappearing into anonymity was the point at which Muslim contextualization had been taken too far. But Phil Partial wrote a response in the same journal, titled Danger, New Directions in Contextualization. And it proved to be an influential framing of what followed. It gave the sense of a master whose students had taken his ideas too far and needed reining in. Partial took Travis's C spectrum and reinterpreted it as the measuring stick where missionaries had gone too far and transgressed into Islamic syncretism. I submit, said Partial, that C1 starts at low contextualization and works up incrementally to C4 at the high end. Everything within the sector is legitimate, provided it's constantly cross-referenced and subordinated to biblical truth, end quote. But C5, said Partial, had moved into what he called the syncretism spectrum. Partial had been opposed by the missionaries as being too innovative, but now he is adamant. He had taken contextualization as far as it should go, C4. Others were now sliding into a zone of what he called syncretism. And he had empirical evidence at hand to point to what he meant. It was the results of the 1995 Pew survey in Bangladesh that I mentioned before, that was called the Islampur survey, so what the location wasn't given away. Yes, there have been good news in the survey that virtually 100% of those interviewed held Jesus and not Muhammad to be their only savior. Most read the Gospels daily, and they attended what pastors called Christian worship weekly, by which presumably he meant a Friday Bible gathering that he had done himself. But dangerously in Partial's view, 96% of them in the survey still held the Quran to be one of the holy books. Half still went to the community mosque on Friday. And perhaps most disturbing for the journal's readers, 45% of them do not affirm God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Partial turned the question to his readers, quote, "What do we have here? Contextualization or syncretism?" Partial's position was that syncretism began in the mosque, whose prayers were pregnant with Islamic theology, he said, and they drew participants into a fundamental allegiance to Muhammad. Travis wrote a response to Partial in which he remarked that regarding the orthodoxy of the C5 believers, most American pastors would envy such high levels of church attendance, Bible reading, and clarity on the Trinity. He pleaded with his evangelical readers that the barrier for Muslims entering the kingdom was theological, but it wasn't religious. So it was high time that missionaries found a way that Muslims, quote, can remain Muslims while following Jesus. What followed was a 15-year debate in the pages of several mission journals that, perhaps still goes on today, but definitely 2013, at which syncretism was sort of wielded as a weapon, but no one really properly defined. The final episode, do we have time for the final episode? Yes, we do. Just about. The Son of God Bible Translation Conundrum. Following David Owen's Sirat HaMashiach, which was published in 1987, during the 1990s, there was a series of efforts towards translating Muslim-targeted Bible translations, many of which used glosses for Son of God to avoid connotations of God having physical offspring, which is what was offensive to Muslims, and for similar reasons, using Allah for when God is called Father. I've got some listed there. Some it wasn't just some Arabic ones, some in Indonesia and Pakistan. We won't dwell on them. We're going to go to Bangladesh again, so we've got some continuity here. Though contentious, these new translations were little known in wider mission circles. You can see some of God's beloved, some who came from God, so the Indonesian ones, so different alternatives. They were not prominent in the debates of Muslim Insider movements. They've sort of gone under the radar, but a series of exacerbating events in Bangladesh fed into what became a major evangelical controversy. Now, Milton Coke's team, led on the ground by Manan, had completed a new translation of Mark's Gospel by 2001, and Coke wanted to print, he said in his letters, 100,000 copies. In his view, that was what he needed, one for each baptized family. He may have, in his mind, exaggerated, I don't know, but he wanted a big printout of these translations of Mark's Gospel. Now, the Mark's Gospel translation was given the same title, Injil Sharif, as the Bangladesh Bible Society's Whole New Testament, which had been published just 9 years before. The Global Partners, that's the Coke's organization, version of Mark, used notably more Muslim religious terminology, though, and opened with an insertion of the Quran's Bismillah, in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. The most noticeable difference, though, was that it entirely avoided literal son or father terms when it came to Jesus' relation with God, and it consistently translated Son of God as Messiah, using the Quranic Mashiach. Before an initial print run, Coke wanted the endorsement of other Christian organizations for the new Injil, but he found support hard to come by. In fact, meetings with the Presbyterian Mission to the World and SIM to promote the translation only generated more conflict. At this stage, he was estranged from the Bangladeshi Bible Society too. And it was especially with national Christians that the tensions were. By 2004, Edward Ayub, a former Wahhabi Muslim and a founding member of the Presbyterian Church of Bangladesh, became determined to combat what he saw as a movement that now, with its own Bible, was becoming a threat to the traditional churches. He published a series of Bangla language articles, ran seminars, and began coordinating opposition, so that by 2005, when Global Partners went ahead with a large initial 10,000 copy print run, it was strongly opposed by the national churches. The Bangladeshi Bible Society published a formal notice in one of the country's largest newspapers, publicly dissociating themselves from the translation. Now, some of the rationale for Global Partners' Mark Gospel, translating Huios, the Greek son, specifically as Messiah, Huios there, as Messiah, had come from a Wycliffe consultant, Rick Brown. Throughout the 2000s, as the new Muslim-friendly Bible started to appear, Brown was prolific in defending their functional equivalence to Son of God. He put it to his readers that the idea of God physically begetting children was so repugnant, quote, repugnant to Muslims, that the term Son of God was enough to put them off the rest of the Bible. One Muslim background believer, said Brown, had explained to him the severity of the problem this way. It's a slight, well, if you could prove to me that son of a, B-I-T-C-H, was a title of great distinction in Hebrew, his friend had related to him. But I would still be unable to call Jesus a son of a in my own language. Brown argued, in fact, the meaning the term evoked from Muslims was not at all what the New Testament writers meant by it, since Son of God language emerged in the Bible with the relationship of the Davidic king to God, whose begetting in Psalm 2 referred to his anointing as Messiah. So the title, Son of the Most High, promised to the newborn Jesus in Luke, indicated his messianic inheritance, not his divinity. Brown made sure to qualify that it was not that the early Christians didn't believe in Jesus' divinity, only that up until the Nicene Council, they used a different title to communicate it, the word, logos of God. So the thrust of what Brown was saying was that Messiah and Son of God were effectively synonymous in the New Testament, although translators might also use alternatives, Brown said, such as God's beloved or companion of God. Now, need to finish up? Okay. There was a, yes, I do. Let me just tell you that George Husney, and a biblical missiology website, and a group that published this book, Chrislam, and a very influential online petition, which is saying, you are taking Wycliffe and Bible translators are removing father and son from the Bible, increasing pressure on Wycliffe in particular. Also, the Presbyterian Church in their General Assembly pronounced against it, said if missionaries in your Presbyterian congregation are supporting these initiatives, please investigate and consider withdrawing your financial support for them. So Wycliffe entered a period of crisis and backtracked, and as a kind of a last resort to restore its reputation, submitted itself to a panel, an international tribunal really, put together by the World Evangelical Alliance, who gave a verdict by May 2013 that divine father-son language, quote, should always be translated with the most directly equivalent familial words, end quote. When there was not a semantically dominant option, the panel cautioned strongly against opting for a social son word over a son by nature one, in case it might blur the distinction between Jesus' unique sonship and believers' adopted sonship. There was Jesus' sonship and there was our sonship. But it did give some wiggle room actually for using qualifiers, so son derived from God, son belonging to God. Anyway, the verdict was enough to appease the conservatives, restore Wycliffe's standing, and reduce tensions. Disagreements over insider movements persist, but the public containing of Wycliffe was a symbolic moment in which the global evangelical community together set a limit on the excesses of Muslim contextualization. Interestingly, more than Muslim identifying Jesus followers, it had been the sense that Holy Scripture was being changed that has stirred up millions of American evangelical mission donors. It was apparent that even icon-shunning evangelicals regarded a certain set of word symbols as sacrosanct. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you.